I'm willing to admit Justice Democrats failed. I'm willing to admit that.
What is it like to work very hard on something, only to have the fruits of your labor fall short of expectations? What is it like to put lots of time and energy into a project, only to see it collapse in front of you? What is it like to invest your hopes and dreams into something you care deeply about, only to see your efforts fail?
I don't know. How's your YouTube channel going?
Thank you, Preemptive Troll, but that's not what I'm referring to. Our old pal Kyle Kulinski seems to believe that the Justice Democrats, an organization that he co-founded, has failed its primary objective.
You think I want to come out here and shit on the group that I co-founded? Is that something I want to do? Yeah, this thing which is like the defining feature of everything I've done in my life, the main thing I'm supposed to be most proud of. Yeah, I want to come out here and let everybody know they're not doing any of the things that they're supposed to. Yeah, I want to do that. How f***ing dense do you have to be? How dumb do you have to be to believe that? This doesn't make me happy. This makes me miserable. It makes me feel like we f***ed up from day one. And we did.
I'm not making fun of Kyle. In a lot of ways, I actually admire what he did. Don't get me wrong, I don't agree with most of the agenda promoted by the Justice Democrats. I'm not a fan of a single representative they've elected. I admire it in that Kyle, along with his co-founders, have actually lived their values. In the world of internet punditry, there are a lot of people who simply regurgitate talking points they heard from someone smarter than them, and think that means they're doing activism or something important. Talk is cheap. Action is hard. And the Justice Democrats have had their successes. Almost no one thought that Joe Crowley, a member of Democratic leadership in the House, the guy who probably would have been Speaker one day, would fall to a political novice. You see, it's not by my standards that the Justice Democrats have failed. It's by Kyle's standards, and the standards of most of the online left, that they've fallen short. The expectation was that they were going to fight to get progressive priorities passed right now.
Fight! Fight! Fight!
That hasn't happened for a number of reasons. It's interesting that Kyle invokes the Tea Party as the model for what he wanted the Justice Democrats to be.
The original name, the working name for Justice Democrats when I co-founded it, was the Left Tea Party. Now, we eventually settled on Justice Democrats, but the actual idea in its genesis was, let's create a Left Tea Party. The whole point was to get a bunch of them elected, get a block, send them to D.C., and have them act exactly like the Tea Party. The Tea Party took on John Boehner and hated John Boehner just as much as they hated Barack Obama. And they made John Boehner's life a living hell because they wouldn't fall in line until they got their way. That is exactly what we wanted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and all the Justice Democrats to do. And here's an article in Bloomberg saying, they're now behind the scenes saying, we're not going to do that.
The Tea Party conservatives talked a big game, but by what measure were they actually successful? Representatives on the state and local level who were elected in the Tea Party wave of 2010 did implement conservative reforms to their respective areas. Tea Party House members did successfully stall Barack Obama's agenda. He failed to pass any major legislation after his first 2 years in the presidency. But what in terms of a positive agenda did the Tea Party representatives in Congress actually pass? Other than the 2017 tax cut bill, I can't think of a single one. They couldn't even repeal Obamacare when Republicans controlled every branch of government. Turns out that passing an agenda is a lot harder than stalling one. During the Trump presidency, we only saw debt increase more, something that Tea Partiers supposedly thought was an existential threat to our nation's well-being. On top of all that, they seem to have even abandoned the rhetoric of small government and classical liberalism. With the possible exception of Rand Paul, nobody within the Republican caucus even pretends to care about the debt or the size and scope of government. If anything, most of the people who talked the language of liberty during the Obama administration seem to be fine with using the government to accomplish their ends. This is anathema to what the Tea Party supposedly got elected on. By the measure of rhetoric, and I do believe rhetoric matters, the Justice Democrats are nearly as successful as the Tea Party has ever been on the federal level. They have people who probably don't agree with them speaking their language, or at the very least, walking some rhetorical tightrope in an attempt to not piss their left flank off. Whether or not this will last remains to be seen, but personally, I think the left is winning the long game, which is ironic, because their rank and file want results now. They genuinely think their agenda could be realized within the next few years. This is the result of flawed assumptions, many of which I've talked about before. One of these assumptions is the idea that you just need to fight to get what you want.
Fight! Fight! Fight!
Therefore, not getting what you want is just a failure of courage or character. As an example of this, let's listen to what Kyle thinks President Biden should do about Joe Manchin, the intransigent Democratic senator from West Virginia.
If they really wanted this, you know what Joe Biden would do? He would call up Joe Manchin. He'd have his favorability numbers in front of him. Now, I don't know Manchin's favorability numbers off the top of my head, so I'm just making this number up. But it'd be something along the lines of, "Hey, Joe, it's Joe. I need you to understand something. My approval rating just came in at 62%. You know what that is? That's a honeymoon period, son. I'm an incredibly popular president at the moment. I can't miss at the moment, son. Oh, look at this. I see your approval rating is 33%. I almost double your approval rating. What would you think if I went and did some rallies in West Virginia starting next week for a primary opponent against you? Would you like that? What if I used all of the resources of the Democratic Party and all of the money and call all my donors and tell my donors, don't give to Joe Manchin, he's blacklisted, we're going to support a primary opponent of Joe Manchin, an opponent to his left." Would you like that, Joe? Oh, you wouldn't like that. You wouldn't want me to use my incredible popularity to crush you and end your career permanently. Well, there is a way we can avoid that. Here's how we avoid that. If you vote for this $15 minimum wage, we're going to put it in the $1.9 trillion bill. If you vote for the $15 minimum wage, you're going to be my best friend. I'm going to use my popularity to go to your state and campaign for you. And I'll tell my donors to donate to you. And if any primary challenger runs against you, I'll support you. It's, hey, listen, son, I could be your best friend or I could be your worst enemy. It's up to you. But I don't think you want this fight now.
Before we get into how silly this is, I want to point out that Kyle is aggrieved over the 2020 presidential Democratic primary because he believes that Barack Obama intervened in the process on Joe Biden's behalf.
Somehow, in a political masterstroke at the last minute, you had Obama make the phone call to Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar, and they dropped out and endorsed Biden. Which, without that, Biden would not have won. Do you understand what I'm telling you?
That didn't actually happen, as I've argued several times on this channel. But even if it was true, just consider the hypocrisy. Kyle thinks that Bernie was cheated because a former president involved himself in a primary election. Yet he thinks that a sitting president should involve himself in a Senate primary to help pass a certain agenda. I'm not sure how he squares that circle. Let's forget about the ethics of it and just consider the practicality. Biden has pretty consistently floated around a 53% approval rating with a 40% disapproval. That's a net positive of 13 points. That's above water, but it's actually not that good historically speaking for someone this early in his presidency. The numbers on individual senators are not polled nearly as often, but according to a survey conducted by Statista, Joe Manchin is overall 5 points underwater. So it would appear as though Kyle is correct. Joe Biden is a lot more popular than Joe Manchin. So the only explanation for why he's not threatening Manchin with a primary opponent is that he's corrupt. Or something like that. Except that Joe Manchin, if he chooses to run for re-election, won't be up until 2024. Joe Biden, should he choose to run again as well, will be busy with a re-election effort of his own. That's a long time from now, and if history tells us anything, it's that presidents get less popular over the course of their tenure. Here's another fly in the ointment. Those are national numbers. Joe Manchin is not elected nationally. He gets elected in West Virginia. I could not find approval rating numbers by state, so let's just look at some vote totals. Joe Biden got 29.69% of the West Virginia vote in 2020. Donald Trump won every single county. Percentage-wise, it was Trump's second best state behind only Wyoming. In 2018, Joe Manchin won a close race with 49.6% of the vote. It's worth noting that, despite the fact that 2020's turnout exceeded 2018's by over 200,000 votes, Manchin's Republican opponent got 35,000 more votes than Joe Biden did. If both men are on the ballot in 2024, I suspect that Manchin will do exactly what he did in 2012, when he was on the same ballot as Barack Obama. Manchin refused to endorse the presidential candidate of his own party, and distanced himself from Obama as much as he possibly could, and he eked out a victory. Unless something drastic happens in West Virginia in the next 2 years, I don't think Biden pressuring Manchin electorally will work. I don't think that Kyle conflating national numbers with West Virginia voters is some small oversight. I think it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding he has about politics. Recently, Kyle said this about the Justice Democrats organization.
This is a conversation I've had a number of times with a number of people, but as a co-founder of Justice Democrats, one of the things that I learned the hard way is that whenever you have institutions, it's really hard to keep an institution on the tracks. Because then there's a bureaucracy, then there's so many voices in the room, then there's so many competing visions. And it's really hard to get an institution or a group to stay true to the original message every step of the way and be truly principled. And I think that's just part of the nature of doing a big project, is that when you get so many people involved and you have so many competing voices and when you get a bureaucracy, you don't have that clarity of vision and the small team where you keep it close to the chest. And there are consequences to that, man.
The Justice Democrats as an institution is pretty small. It has a staff of less than a dozen people, and it's an organization with an explicit mission and ethos. Tiny and focused though it is, not everyone there is on the same page, at least according to Kyle. And yet he thinks the vast majority of the country, with nearly 240 million eligible voters, is on the same page as progressives in Congress.
Go ahead, come after me. I'm on the side of 80% of the American people with what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for a $15 minimum wage. I'm with the majority of Americans. I'll tank this bill, and I'm tanking it on behalf of the American people. The American people send their regards.
So we're supposed to believe that a small organization can't keep to its ideological mission, but the entire country is more or less on the same page for what they want from politics. The biggest reason why you're unlikely to get a left-wing Tea Party is because the Justice Democrats' agenda is not nearly as appealing to voters as progressives think it is. It turns out that we live in a big, diverse country with red areas and blue areas, where lots of people have different values and beliefs. In fact, diversity is one of the reasons why you are unlikely to see a left-wing Tea Party movement within the Democratic Party. Most people know that the Republican Party consists mostly of white Christian men. These people are far more likely to be conservative, if not as an ideology, then as an identity. The Democratic Party is more racially and religiously diverse, which makes it much more difficult to keep everyone on the same page. As Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Wheeler write in Prius or Pickup, at this point, many American readers who identify as non-white or as part of an ethnic minority might find themselves confused. They are probably Democrats, as we noted a few pages back. About 3/4 of racial and ethnic minorities vote Democrat. This includes a consistent 90% or more of African Americans. Yet, many communities of color include people who value traditional family hierarchies and top-down authority. In fact, African Americans are the group most likely to have members with fixed worldviews. In other words, being a member of the Democratic coalition doesn't necessarily mean that you're an across-the-board progressive in your outlook. Older Black Americans, one of the most important constituencies in the coalition, are some of the most conservative people in this country. It's no surprise that elderly African Americans were the downfall of Bernie Sanders in both 2016 and 2020. In their book Asymmetric Politics, Ideological Republicans and Group Interest Democrats, authors Matt Grossman and David Hopkins argued that the primary difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is that the former is held together by abstract ideological commitments, whereas the latter is a diverse collection of interest groups held together by policy goals. To demonstrate this, Grossman and Hopkins did a systemic analysis of rhetoric during the presidential primary debates between 1996 and 2012. They found that Republican presidential candidates were more than twice as likely as Democrats to mention ideology or principles in their debate statements, and were nearly 3 times as likely to invoke conservative principles as Democrats were to invoke liberal principles. Republicans also more frequently drew upon American imagery than did Democrats. By comparison, Democrats cited social, demographic, and interest groups at markedly higher rates than Republicans, and mentioned new policy proposals at a slightly higher frequency. Online leftists love to talk about how the donor class drives politics.
We know what drives politics. What drives politics is the donors.
While I do believe they exaggerate this, donor opinion does matter. In fact, a difference in donor opinion is one of the driving forces behind the differences between the two parties. As Grossman and Hopkins write, as measured by feeling thermometers, Republican donors expressed very positive evaluations of conservatives and very negative evaluations of liberals. Democrats maintained the reverse view, but did not hold it as strongly than did Republican donors about the interest groups affiliated with their party, though both expressed negative evaluations of groups associated with the opposition. In choosing which candidate to support, Republican donors were more likely to say that conservative ideology is always important. They were also much more likely to agree that donors are motivated by ideological goals. In contrast, Democratic donors were more likely to view an interest group's endorsement as critical. Recent research confirms that Democratic donors are more interested than Republican donors in demographic representation and less concerned with ideological fidelity. Even among donors to organizations ostensibly designed to increase women's representation in public office, Republican supporters were focused focused on electing conservatives rather than increasing the share of female candidates. This is amusing because this is something that progressives particularly loathe.
I don't care if you're gay, I don't care if you're trans, I don't care if you're a woman, I don't care if you're gender fluid. If you're doing the wrong policies, I'm going to call you out.
This matches a broader pattern among all party organization donors. Republicans aim to reduce the size and scope of government, whereas Democrats wish to pursue a variety of single-issue causes. The Republican donor base is made up of ideological conservatives, whereas the Democratic donor base is a collection of policy issue activists, often motivated by social identity groups' concerns. Again, I would argue that conservatism is less a political ideology that seeks to reduce the size and scope of government, but acts more as an identity in its own right. But that's a different video for a different day. For our purposes today, the point remains the same. The donor class of each respective party has very different priorities. Republican donors are largely on the same page in terms of overall outlook, whereas Democratic donors are champions of much more niche issues. Remember this the next time someone tells you that the two main political parties are the same. It's not just the donor class that has an asymmetrical view of politics, it's the rank and file as well. In December of 2018, Gallup asked registered Republicans and Democrats what direction they wanted to see their party go in. By a margin of 57 to 37, Republicans said more conservative. By a margin of 54 to 41, registered Democrats said more moderate. I hear progressives complain about Democrats constantly trying to compromise, whereas Republicans refuse to reciprocate. Well, these are all big reasons why things play out this way. And the fact that progressives are on the outside looking in is telling. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that, in another country, with more viable political parties, she and Joe Biden would not be in the same party. That's probably true. In the United States, progressives are essentially a party within a party. And to make no mistake, they are the minority faction. They're another constituency in the big tent, and a relatively small one at that. As much star power and attention as the squad got when they joined Congress, the Democratic Party swore in 40 new moderate representatives at the same time. Democratic leadership is actually afraid they might lose these seats as well, whereas progressives are invariably in safe blue districts. Could progressives throw their weight around more effectively in Congress? Sure, probably. But this idea that they're going to achieve major policy wins exactly how they want them and when they want them is frankly naive.